Good evening and welcome to Future Melbourne Network's inaugural public brainstorming session on creating a better future for Melbourne. My name is Michael Short and I produce The Zone, a forum for ideas for change. It's published in The Age and across Fairfax Media's national suite of sites and apps. And it's all about the most important marketplace that we have. And that's the free marketplace for ideas. And ideas is precisely why we're here tonight. The Future Melbourne Network was formed by a group of passionate people. It's about ensuring that Melbourne remains a great city. They want the place to be safe. They want the place to be environmentally clean and sustainable. They want the place to be socially inclusive and economically robust and successful for all the citizens. They want, in short, to keep a great city great and help make it greater. You can find out more about them online. The website is Future Melbourne Network, all one word, .org. Tonight's seminar is What is Your Vision for Melbourne? We have some extraordinary experts and they'll be up here in a moment and I will introduce them presently. Before I do though, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the sponsors, Future Leaders, Urbis and Fed Square. Tonight's speakers have formidable knowledge and will bring a range of perspectives, indeed vision, to the debate. They are the Honourable Robert Doyle, Lord Mayor of the City of Melbourne, Major Brendan Nottle of the Salvation Army and congratulations Brendan, Melburnian of the Year for 2013. Rob McGauran, he's an award-winning architect and urban designer and a spirited participant in community debate. And Micaela Drieberg of Monash City Council, where she was the mayor last year. Melbourne is often cited as the world's most livable city. But is that really true if you live further than, say, 20 kilometres from the CBD? What were supposed to be inviolable boundaries for this city have been broken by successive governments to the extent that they are 50% greater than we're 50% greater than they were. Indeed, it is 150 kilometres from the eastern boundary to the western boundary of Melbourne. That's further than from the CBD to Bendigo. Have we got the density mix right? Do we really need to worship the quarter-acre block? And I'm sorry if I'm being sacrilegious there, but is that what we really need these days? Transport infrastructure is clearly in need of investment and insight. A rail link to Tulla, for example, has for many people for a long time been a no-brainer. Where is it? Are we really a bike-friendly place? Many people would argue we've got a long way to go. My work in The Zone has made it clear to me that leadership comes from the bottom up. It comes from the community. It does not come from the top down. We're here tonight, I would argue, to talk about ideas, not ideology. I think that there's a big difference, and I find it unhelpful that people tend to position themselves on a linear ideological scale of left to right. What about the other axis? Authority to anarchy. It's not about left to right. I would argue that those terms have become all but meaningless. Yes, government has an important role to play, but government tends to follow, not lead, and that is how it should be. In other words, there's no them, there's just us. Innovation and leadership and change is driven by the community, and that is what tonight is about. Let's go to our first speaker, Salvation Army's Brendan Nottle. Brendan, thank you very, very much.
Well, good evening. Thanks for this opportunity to come and share my vision for Melbourne. And I have to do it in 10 minutes or less. So I thought I'd go for a very, very simple vision. How to end homelessness. It's meant to be funny. How to end homelessness. And also, who's responsible for ending homelessness here in the city. And what I'd like to do is actually take you back to 1835, because it was there that the founding principles of the city were established. John Batman was a person that came on a ship called the Rebecca, and he arrived in Melbourne in 1835. And on 8th of June 1835, he actually declared that this is a good place for a village. He also said that we'd like to call this village Batmania, and thankfully that name never stuck. But he got back on the ship and he travelled back to Launceston. Then in 1835, there was another ship that came in August, and that was with James Pascoe Faulkner, called the Enterprise. And then he returned, and then in October 1835, Pascoe Faulkner returned with his wife on the Enterprise again. Batman returned, and also Henry Reid. The very interesting thing was, there's no question that John Batman was driven by commercial reasons for being here. He was looking for fertile pastoral land to expand his wealth. But when he returned to Launceston and he spoke to Henry Reid, who'd also been here, Reid was also excited about the opportunity of the founding of a new settlement. And the reason for that was Reid was a devout Methodist. And there were two philosophies that were driving him. One was he was very passionate about this idea of creating opportunity that would enable the social uplift of all. He was also very passionate about this idea of bringing people together to care for each other, particularly the most vulnerable. And so what happened was Batman said we need help to establish the settlement at Port Phillip, or Batmania. And Henry Reid said that he would loan £3,000 to Batman and also 2 ships so that he could bring livestock and equipment to help establish this new settlement of Batmania, which is now Melbourne. That was 1835. Let's fast forward to 1865, where Henry Reid has amassed a significant wealth down in Launceston, and he and his wife pack up what they have and they travel to London. And they end up in the presence of some more Methodists, William and Catherine Booth, who were the founders of the Salvation Army in 1865. They were in the process of commencing the Salvation Army. And interestingly, Henry Reid says to William and Catherine Booth that he would pay their stipend for the rest of their lives so that they didn't need to draw a wage from the Salvation Army. He also said that what they were doing in the East End of London clearly fitted with his philosophy for life, which was about creating social uplift for all and also about bringing people together to care for the most vulnerable. So he significantly funded that work in the East End of London. Come with me, back from London to Melbourne in 1869. And Dr. John Singleton and John Horsley, another Methodist, the Methodists popping up all over the place, were lobbied heavily by the Melbourne City Mission. And they were saying to Singleton and Horsley, we need a free medical clinic. And so that was established in Collingwood. Horsley and Singleton were incredibly entrepreneurial, and they went about the business of dealing with significant social issues no matter what the cost. What happened then was Singleton and Horsley continued to work with the Salvation Army that had just commenced in Bourke Street in the mid-1880s. And what happened was the person that was running the Salvation Army at 6 and 9 Bourke Street would actually drag his desk down from the first floor of that building out onto Bourke Street. And he would lobby politicians as they walked past. And he would say, here are the significant social issues of our day. You must do something. You must be entrepreneurial and creative and innovative in dealing with these significant social issues. And it wasn't just the Salvation Army, it was the Melbourne City Mission, it was the YMCA, it was a whole range of social welfare organisations were about social reform. And it was all driven by this concept of creating social uplift for all and bringing people together to care for the most vulnerable. I want to fast forward to Melbourne today, and there's been a significant shift. Not-for-profits, including the one that I work for, have moved from being social reformist, full of zeal, to being focused on service delivery, which is significant, which is important, but we've lost that edge. And the reason for that, I think, is that we've tended to be concerned about taking risk, because if we take risk in being innovative and creative, we may risk our funding from our private and public supporters. So we withdraw from the risk. The other change that's happened, which is very significant, is that in Melbourne, we've moved from being that compassionate society to perhaps taking on a different ilk, where when we look at vulnerable people, particularly the homeless, there's been this increasing attitude of saying, look, I'm sorry about your plight, but there's nothing we can do to help you. What do we need to do to actually return to that original heart of this city, those founding principles that said we need to create social uplift and we need to be a community which is compassionate for all? Well, sadly, on January the 5th this year, there was the death of a homeless man that was murdered at the age of 42. Where? at Enterprise Park, the very location where James Pascoe Faulkner brought his ship, the Enterprise. It was the very same location where Batman disembarked from his ship. It was the very same location that Henry Reid stood and gathered people around and talked about the founding principles of the city, which were about social uplift for all and coming together and caring for the most vulnerable. They did it in that same location where Mouse died. And fortunately, because of the Age and other media outlets, Melburnians have started to shift their attitude so that rather than homelessness being a peripheral issue, it's actually become a mainstream issue. And Melburnians now are starting to ask the question, why? Why in the world's most livable city do we have people sleeping rough in very, very vulnerable environments? It's time to do something. But when we come to this issue of homelessness, it's a very complex one. There's no simple answer. And homelessness can be divided into three sectors. The first is primary homelessness, which includes those people that sleep rough on the streets. There's secondary homelessness, which are those people that live in emergency accommodation and crisis shelters. There's tertiary homelessness, which represents those people that are living in really terrible rooming houses and couch surfing. And we can do something. I think what we need to do is, rather than focus on the long term, we need to also focus on what's happening tonight. And we need to make available to people that are sleeping rough, not just here in Melbourne, in the city of Melbourne, but right across metropolitan Melbourne. We need to make available to them safe spaces where they can go and rest and they know they won't be stabbed or bashed during the night. We have to find spaces that are supervised and safe for the rough sleepers. Secondly, in addressing this issue of homelessness, what we also need to do is consider the fact that all of us need to strengthen our resolve. Corporates, local, state, federal government, individuals, philanthropists, not-for-profits, we all have to start taking risk and gather together and be innovative. And I'm encouraged because it started to happen. Collingwood Football Club, who came and spoke to us, said that they wanted to be engaged in significant social change in this city. They said they were sick and tired of hearing people being bashed in terrible rooming houses. And they actually wanted to lift the risk from us and start to rent houses in their name and furnish those houses. And then we would put homeless people into those houses and care for them. And those homeless people in time start to pay rent, so the model is actually self-supporting. And what started to happen is we have 10 houses. Collingwood are very passionate now about getting at least 50 houses, if not more, because they know that they are about the business of reducing homelessness in the city through that model. What we need is other corporates and philanthropists, local, state, federal government, to step up to the plate and say, we're going to engage in this too. We're actually going to work together to end homelessness. Thirdly, if we're going to resolve homelessness, we need to understand that many people that sleep rough in the city and that are in terrible rooming houses are actually suffering from really significantly complex issues. And so it's not just a matter of getting a bed for them. It's actually surrounding them with the supports that they need: health, mental health, employment, training, legal, social, on it goes. And those services currently exist. So when we think about building accommodation for homeless people, rather than trying to build the whole thing, perhaps we need to find locations where the services are already provided and look for creative and innovative ways to build the accommodation next to the supports that already exist. And finally, when it comes to the issue of homelessness, it's my responsibility. And in fact, it's yours too. Because as Melburnians, with those foundation principles of creating social uplift, coming together and supporting the most vulnerable, we need to look for opportunities to engage with homeless people. If you see someone that's sleeping rough and you feel comfortable enough to do it, go and have a conversation. It doesn't have to be too long. It's just a matter of saying some positive and encouraging words to a homeless person. And in doing that, you will be sending a very powerful and profound message to that person that they are no longer invisible, that they're not forgotten, that people do care. And in sharing those positive and encouraging words, you're sowing hope within them. And for homeless people, that's probably their greatest need. Together, if we strengthen our resolve, I really firmly believe that we can achieve this vision of ending homelessness here in Melbourne. Thank you.
You might not be surprised to learn that Brendan, as well as running the Salvation Army in the centre of the city here, is Collingwood Football Club's volunteer chaplain. I don't think there's a coincidence with what's happening with Collingwood. Micaela Drieberg is an elected councillor for the city of Monash and, as I said earlier, was the mayor last year. She's also been deputy mayor and a ministerial advisor. She currently operates her own consultancy which specialises in integrated health planning, community engagement, leadership and public speaking, which we're about to see. Micaela also teaches postgrad subjects at the University of Melbourne and hosts a TV show on Channel 31 called Sacred Spaces. Micaela, thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I'll just have to adjust the microphone for us short people. When I initially was asked to come and speak here today, I was a little bit stumped like Brendan and thought, how do you put your vision for Melbourne into 10 minutes? So I went to family and to friends and to colleagues and asked what they wanted. And there was definitely common themes that came through. Airport transfer links came up, transportation in general, and even the economics and how we live as well. But when I tried to pull out what the common themes there definitely were two common themes, and that's what I'll discuss today, and I'll do it from a suburban perspective. So the first one was that planning isn't about cities, it's not about places, it's about people. And Brendan's given us some ideas about some of the challenges, the issues and the opportunities with some of the people that he works with. But these challenges, issues, opportunities go across many different areas across Melbourne metropolis. And from a suburban perspective, there is a lot of diversity there as well. The image behind me shows that there are many different people, many different wants, many different needs. We're ageing, but we're young, we have different interests, and we live in different places. And we want to live in different places. We want different opportunities and we want different choices as well. So how do we do that? That's the big question. Well, in the city of Monash, are people familiar where Monash is? Yep, I'm seeing some nods in the crowd. So for those of you that aren't, we are located in the southeast of metropolitan Melbourne, and it is about 20 minutes from the city. We are fairly unique in that geographically we aren't that large. We're about 82 square kilometres, but we do have many different activity centres which are behind me up here on the images. But we also have a major university campus, hospital campuses, other educational facilities, train lines, and the list goes on. We're also a big attraction for businesses as well. So how do you accommodate all those needs, all those varying wants as well? We're quite transient in terms of our community and the people that live there, the people that play there, the people that are educated there, and the people that come there for entertainment as well. My response to that is it's about having a vision. And it's about having a shared vision. So behind me are just some visions that I extracted from a few council plans across metropolitan Melbourne. And these are the current plans that are out right now. And you'll see that there's some definite commonalities, but there's some differences as well. There's definitely a focus on cities, there's a focus on communities, and there's a focus on where we live. But I have to say one of my favourites is from the city of Wyndham. And it's because it starts off with the people and it talks about our future as well. And if we don't focus on our people and what their needs are, what their wants are, and if we don't think about the future, then we're going to be in a little bit of trouble. The other reason why I mentioned Monash before as well is that we are the middle ring. And we often get caught up when we are talking about our vision for Melbourne about inner city and some of those challenges there, and also the outer suburbs as well. But there is a whole middle ring which is fairly well surfaced. We have access to good infrastructure, but there are varying needs and wants as well. And it's how do we balance them? How do we focus on our different type of people and their different types of wants, and how do we respond to them? I often hear my role at the City of Monash around some of the concerns around amenity, around activity centres. So there's a big focus on adding urbanism towards suburbia as well. So adding all those different elements that we love about the Melbourne CBD into where we live in the suburbs as well. But with that does come some concerns in terms of how is that going to impact on me? How is it going to impact on the type of houses that might immediately be adjacent to these city centres as well? Another thing that often comes up is the different types of housing. So we mentioned the half-acre blocks, which a lot of people do revere, but then how do we give other options as well? How do we give apartment living options? How do we introduce more units? How do we still accommodate for people that do want the single dwelling houses as well? And I think it comes back down to different options, giving people different opportunities to live in different ways that they feel comfortable in that meets their different needs. And with so many different people, and with that changing every day in the city of Melbourne and Melbourne metropolis in general, then we really need to be constantly revisiting that question. The other common theme that came through was about being focused on different options towards the future as well, and it was about being outcome focused. So again, it's nothing groundbreaking, it's nothing new, but it's something that can be easily forgotten. And there's a quote that I love where if you know where you're heading, you'll know when you've arrived. And when we focus on the outcome that we want to achieve, then we'll start to see some different changes come along the way as well. An example that I like to use is around our sporting infrastructure. So I'm seeing some smiles here, but this is a very typical image that you see in sporting clubs across the Melbourne metropolitan area, and in particular in the middle rung suburbs and the inner suburbs as well, which again, some will argue are well serviced by infrastructure, but it's ageing infrastructure. And more and over again, I hear from our sporting clubs who aren't able to meet the needs of their current people and their future people as well. So female participation is actually growing in sports, but some of these sporting clubs can't meet those needs because this is what the change rooms look like. And this is what isn't so enticing to our females that want to participate in sporting clubs. So again, it's about being outcome focused. It's about thinking about who are we trying to engage, who are we trying to meet the needs of, and how can we do that? And urinals don't really do that for females. This is another common feature that you'll see in the outer suburbs. So it's lots of new dwellings and a big empty space in the middle, often earmarked for a school, often earmarked for a primary school, that is reliant on quotas. And that's not only for education, we see that with the health sector as well. So whilst we all would agree that we need more health services, we need more hospitals, we need more education facilities, policies are in place right now that require us to have a certain amount of people living in an area before that even eventuates. But why do we need to do that? How amazing would it be if that school was already there and then the people came? And how great would it be if that primary school was there before all the children in the surrounding areas actually needed to go to high school? And then the next question comes, well, where's the high school going to go? Do we need to meet those numbers before the high school eventuates? This is an image which typically depicts the suburbs, jumping in your car to go where you need to go. But my vision for the city of Melbourne is making the healthiest choice the easiest choice. So the easiest option to coming into the city today was for me to walk to my train station and to jump on the train. Wouldn't it be fantastic if that was everyone's easiest option? Last night I had some friends over for dinner, and when it came to coffee and tea time, we realised we didn't have any milk. But we popped baby in the pram and her big brother came along too, and our biggest decision was, do we turn left or right at the end of the street to walk up to our local shops to get some milk? That's my vision for Melbourne, to make that the easiest choice for people rather than jumping in their cars and having to travel 10 minutes to wherever they need to go. And this is just an image which I think hopefully most people would aspire to and would love to see in the place where they live as well. Finally, I just thought I'd give you another example in terms of having an outcome focus. So has anyone here heard of the Vancouver Agreement before? I'm seeing a few different hands here. So again, I don't think it's anything groundbreaking, but it's something that is so obvious and something that would be so wonderful to have here in Victoria, but just doesn't exist yet. So this was agreement between 3 levels of government. It was outcome focused and it was partnership focused as well. So something that I would love to see here in metropolitan Melbourne is agreements between our federal governments, our state governments and our local governments in terms of the outcome that we want and how we'll achieve it. A partnership focus to do that. You know, we have some fantastic visions for Melbourne, but there isn't legislation to back it up. So before I came here, I just did a quick scan of our almost 30-year-old Planning and Environment Act, and the words vision and engagement didn't appear. The words health and people, they were there, but they were there once each. I'd like to see that change. So my vision for Melbourne is pretty simple. It's let's remember it's about the people and let's all think about the outcome. Because at the end of the day, I think we'd all agree we want happy, healthy people. And we want them to live in an environment that helps them to achieve that. Often we get caught up in the methodology and the process as to how we'll achieve that. But if we all work together, and it transcends politics as well, then we might just achieve that. Thank you.
Not all short people are short. Rob McGauran is an adjunct professor in architectural practice at Monash University. He's founding director of MGS Architects and Urban Designers and specialises in the resolution of built form and master planning for complex sites. He has a view to developing sustainable places and communities, and there's that word sustainable again, and the other key word of the evening, communities. His built projects are known for their innovation, relevance to contemporary issues and community focus, and include Woodstock Rooming House, Brighton Baths redevelopment, Drill Hall redevelopment, Clifton Hill Rail Bridge, Gisborne Retail Complex, and Dalgany redevelopment. Rob, thank you very much.
Thank you all. Well, as the urban designer and architect here, I'll show a few pictures for you tonight, as we always do. Look, I've entitled this talk tonight, From Me to Us. When we look out the window here tonight, we see the incredible legacy that our forefathers wrote this city with. A fabulous parkland environment, an adjacent station. If we go turn out and look up Swanston Street, magnificent edifices of library, town hall and governance, and places of worship and coming together as community. But in the post-war age, an age of mobility and cheap energy, there seems to, in my mind, have been a shift to a city framed around the individual and the corporation. Obviously with some notable exceptions, but nevertheless one written with a different purpose. Our challenge is to ask us all here tonight, and the one that I'm putting to you, is what is the ambition with which we want to write the future city? So the 3 propositions I'd like to put to you today are these. Melbourne as a city that shares knowledge, Melbourne as a city that shares opportunity, and Melbourne as a city that feeds itself. Now they seem pretty lame, simple propositions, I would hear most of you saying, but being close to the coalface as I am, I would say that it's never been under more threat. So proposition number 1 that I'm putting to you tonight is Melbourne as a network of university towns and university cities. We are already a great university city. We are a great research city. We're in the top 6 in bioscience in the world. We have some of the greatest faculties teaching subject areas in the world today. We have wonderful advantages of a cohesive, multicultural society in which these students come. And for many of you who walk around the areas of Parkville and Carlton, you would get this. You know, the fact that we have had this conjunction of health institutions and academic institutions along the Swanston Street corridor, combined with a visionary council who has supported that with a framework that's enabled higher quality environments conducive to the sorts of student housing, etc., that might populate those areas, has seen that area undertake extraordinary change in that time. What's more interesting to me is what is happening in the suburbs. And when I started the master planning for Monash University, I was surprised to see that the visitations at Monash University's precinct were only slightly less than that to Chadstone Shopping Centre each year. That the monies generated by the university each year at that location was about comparable to Chadstone. The number of people employed was similar to Chadstone. But when you looked in the planning frameworks for our city, there was a great emphasis on activity centres, and Chadstone firmly sat in that. But Monash was this sort of too hard sort of location that nobody knew quite what to do with. But these universities are all changing, and they are engaging with the places in which they sit. At Monash, we have around about 600 major corporations within a kilometre. We have Monash Medical Centre growing. The university itself investing many millions of dollars each year in improving the quality of its research and teaching spaces. The university and educational system in Australia is a larger exporter than our wheat industry. So when I hear of some of our industrial organisations, I suppose, falling down by the wayside, I'm encouraged by the potential that this proposition of the university towns and university cities offers. And when you think about those opportunities of La Trobe in the northern corridor, Sunshine with the major Sunshine Hospital and VU, and the new regional rail in the western corridor, we see this opportunity for a joined up city starting to come to reality if we get a metro to join them up. The second theme I'd like to talk to you about is our livability. We are facing a livability crisis like we have never seen before in this city. Affordable home ownership, we get a big fail on. Affordable rental, we see a huge loss of affordable rental in inner Melbourne, where the 21st century jobs are being created. And access to transport choices as the city has dispersed have got worse and worse, so that we see somebody living in Carlton with access to, I think, around 700,000 jobs within an hour on public transport, someone in East Cranbourne less than 10,000. And governments are really failing to tap into the capacity and interest of institutions in this space. Some of you would be interested to know that some of your super funds are invested in affordable housing in the US and England and the UK, but none of it in Australia. So, the question in my mind was, how do you provide affordable housing plus access to work plus active transport? And the answer lies in part, I think, in the commuter car parks that dot our areas of inner and middle and outer Melbourne. I'm not talking about the areas that the organisations might sell to the private sector, but I'm talking about the areas that have to be retained for commuters long term. Why don't we use the space above those car parks to house people who don't want to have a car? We get the land for nothing. We own it as a community already. All our government in Victoria has to do is agree to apply NRAS places to it and engage with the institutions. The institutions will deliver it and hand it back to the state in between 25 and 40 years, depending on whether we focus on the homeless or a more diversified housing population of key workers and people across all income groups. And it is possible. We've done it with the City of Port Phillip above their public car parks as a practice. We've delivered housing for $160,000 a unit in Port Melbourne. That's pretty affordable by any stretch of the imagination. Why do we need it? Well, the blue in the centre there in the maps prepared by SGS Economics show where the high concentrations of jobs are, and they just happen to focus around where there's also good public transport. I also put in the map in the chart here of how we're investing in solving our affordable housing problem, and you can see the commendable efforts of federal and state governments in 2012-13 and the lamentable level of debate in that space at the moment really needs to be addressed by both federal and state levels. I commend the City of Melbourne for at least looking at the opportunities within its municipality to try and do something, and a number of the other councils. Some other examples of how that's been achieved, and I know the student housing area has been lambasted in the last few days. That's the student housing on the bottom left at Monash University. But that housing will be there for the community of our city in perpetuity. It won't be sold off by the private sector 10 years after they get an NRAS licence. And on the bottom right, the project we did with the City of Melbourne of putting affordable housing above a heritage asset of the community of Melbourne and giving the community of Melbourne back an asset for 99 years on $1 a year as a community hub on the ground floor. Another proposition that I would like to throw in the mix is an idea, well, you know, we've been good in the last half of the 20th century about building freeways, and we have a very good tram and train network in inner Melbourne. But with this development of large areas of inner Melbourne, Docklands, Eagate, Fisherman's Bend, Cremorne, etc., why aren't we talking about connecting them up in a way that doesn't require us to hop on a congested tram or train or hop in our cars, but travel quickly between places by bicycle if we so wish to? It's the cheapest way that we can deliver increased mobility to Melburnians. We have a city culture that loves cycling, we have a topography suited to it, and we have the juxtaposition of these major growth areas in such close proximity. We should be doing it. And the final theme I'd like to talk about is feeding the city. Now again, this sounds a pretty simple proposition, but when you see the spread of Melbourne and what we've been doing, and I put in there for you Melbourne's density relative to its area of city compared to some other cities in the world, just to give you a sense of it. We are currently covering much of our best arable land with housing, and we're not thinking about where we have natural synergies between locations. You know, some of you mightn't be aware that we have some parts of Melbourne that meet the performance parameters for solar farms. Some of those locations also have unlimited access to recycled water. We have some of the best people in the area of agriculture and intensive agriculture in the nation, and in fact in the world, in the research areas there. The Dutch are the second largest food exporters in Europe, you know, in a country that's not much bigger than the city of Brimbank, probably. But the opportunity exists for us, I think, to be much more strategic also about the edge of our city. What are the unique elements of part of the edge of our city that will not only provide employment, not only provide opportunities for research, but will sustain us and make us resilient in the future? At the moment, not enough of that is being thought about. We don't have good policies around this. We don't have good policies, and I'm not just talking about what we eat, but I'm talking about what we use. Why don't we feed the city's energy? Why don't we feed the city's fibre requirements? Why don't we deal with our waste requirements in a very strategic way in this engagement between peri-urban and the central city? So they're my propositions for this evening. Thank you.
To another Robert Doyle. The Honourable Robert Doyle is the serving Lord Mayor of Melbourne and a former leader of the opposition in the Victorian Parliament. He spent 14 years... God, sorry, Robert. He spent 14 years as a Member of Parliament, and during that time, as well as being Leader of the Opposition, he served as Shadow Minister for Health and as Parliamentary Secretary for Health. He is President of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, which I think I'm right in saying is the oldest and biggest of its type in the country. And it does great work. He's also Chairman of the Royal Melbourne Hospital Foundation, a trustee of the Shrine of Remembrance also. He's also involved in a number of charities and not-for-profit organisations, including Odyssey House, Second Bite, the Cancer Council of Victoria, and the White Ribbon Day Foundation. The Honourable Robert Doyle, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Short is sometimes short, Michael, I can promise you that. Could I first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we gather tonight, the members of the Great Kulin Nation, and pay my deep personal respects to their elders past and present, and thank their elders, particularly those of the Wurundjeri and Boomerang, whose lands we're between right here, for the work they do throughout our community. At the city, we like to acknowledge our First Peoples, particularly as we're so proud that they are the oldest continuous culture in the world, and I'm delighted to do it in speaking to you tonight. Michael was saying I was a Member of Parliament for a long time, and I was. And like all politicians, you like to think that you're prescient in some ways. I remember in 2002 when I became leader of my party thinking, what do I think the big issue is over the next 10 years? What is the issue that is going to shape the way that we think about public policy? And the answer I had back then was water. And while I won't congratulate myself for prescience, I think it actually became so. I remember when I created my first shadow cabinet, I created a minister for shadow minister for water resources. I remember one of the senior government people saying to me, not in a confrontational or adversarial way, "I think you've got that wrong, Rob. I think it's an environmental portfolio." And my answer to that was, I disagree. I think it's an economic portfolio, an agricultural portfolio, a social portfolio, an environmental portfolio. And if you think about what we did over that next 10 years in Victoria around changing our culture around the use of water, changing our view of water, and building infrastructure for water, I reckon we got it about right in public policy. If you were to ask me today, as I think about public policy, what is the issue that is going to shape us over the next 10 to 15 years, and what are its implications? I would say to you, it is planning for sustainable future growth, which echoes a number of the threads that I've heard here tonight. And I really believe that, planning for smart growth. We know now for the first time in our history that more than half the world's population lives in cities. That's surprising to the rest of the world, not to us. We're the most highly urbanised nation on earth if you discount, Monaco and Vatican City and places like that. And so we're used to that concentration. But as a couple of the other speakers have said, we haven't always done it terribly well. I want to put to you the proposition that growth is not something to be frightened of, it's to be embraced. But we need to do it in a smart way. If you think back to the 1970s when Melbourne's population was 2 million, okay, it's now grown to double that size. It's now 4 million. And if we're to believe the ABS and other figures, it might be, who knows, 5, 6, 7 million by 2040. We certainly overtake Sydney as Australia's largest city, probably sometime in the 2030s. But if you think about that first stat, 2 million in the 1970s, 4 million now, I would argue that we are ineffably a more prosperous, a more creative, a more sustainable, a more interesting and diverse city than we were in the 1970s. And yet some of the stories tonight quite rightly point out where we got it wrong. But we must have also got something right, unless you want to return to those days when Norman Day described us as a donut city with a dead, empty heart. So it's not all gloom, but there are some dangers, and a couple of the earlier speakers have touched on that, and it's something I feel passionate about. We've got to stop spreading at the edges like some sort of stain. You know, I hear with concern when I hear down in the west, I hear announcements that a whole new suburb of 40,000 people is going to be put down right here. And then, of course, because there's no employment there, they'll jump in their cars, they'll jump onto the Westgate Freeway, there'll be a breakdown on the Westgate Bridge, there'll be bank ups for 25 kilometres, and then people will be saying, what you need to do is build a new Westgate for $6 billion to accommodate these people. Maybe if we'd thought about where we were putting them first, are they connected by means other than the car, and are they close to employment nodes, we wouldn't have that downstream demand. Or I look at outer suburbs like Clyde, out in the city of Casey, where we grow lettuce, and it's the earlier speaker's contention, Rob's contention about growing food. We grow lettuce and leaf vegetables and tomatoes. We grow Melbourne salads there. But it's not the highest and best use. So over that wonderful arable land, growing in good soil, with proximity to water and access to market, instead we're going to roll out houses. And I would argue they're examples of dumb growth, not smart growth. So my contention to you is, I think we'll continue growing. I think that's a good thing for us. I believe in a big Melbourne, but I believe in a big, smart Melbourne. And the question is, how are we going to do that? How are we going to grow in a way which generates prosperity but keeps us sustainable and accommodates those people? We're in the middle, by the way, of one of the great social and urban experiments of the world. Up in Sydney, a small declining town in our north you may have heard of, they go on and on about Barangaroo, their urban development of 22 hectares. 22 hectares. If you think about South Bank, now probably 90% complete. Docklands, probably half complete. Fisherman's Bend, we haven't even started. E-Gate, we haven't even started thinking about yet. If you add all of that, it's 605 hectares. It's 5 times the size of the central city. And that is an urban development experiment that will proceed and roll out over the next 40 years. And so we've got to make sure that what we're doing there adds to that prosperity, sustainability, livability, way of life, character and culture of our city in a way that we're comfortable with. Because if we get it wrong, this is not going to be the city that we love for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. We can show you, because the city now, it's old work, and Ros Hanson and I have talked about this many times. We can show you it's actually not affordable to build houses out on the edge of Melbourne. And it was the reason that some of the earlier speakers, Micaela, touched upon as well, because it's not just about building the housing unit, it's about building the infrastructure, soft and hard, schools, childcare, hospitals, roads, water, sewerage, all of those things that go with it. So if you build 1,000 housing units out on the edge of the city, it costs you about $640 million per 1,000 housing units to provide the infrastructure that's simply not there. If you build with greater intensity in a smart way in the inner city, it certainly costs you to upgrade existing infrastructure, but the cost is about $300 million per 1,000 housing units. And people worry, I know, about their neighbourhoods, and there's a great argument going on in local government now about new zones. And people are very proud of their streets and they're proud of their communities and proud of their neighbourhoods, and that's great. But what I'd like to point out is that if we get greater intensity on just 6% of our land, converting it to a higher density, we've done work at the City of Melbourne that shows that can fit an extra 3.3 million people into our city without touching the vast bulk of those communities and neighbourhoods that people quite rightly prize as their own. But we do need to think about those transport nodes and those activity hubs and how we do allow greater intensity along those corridors. It's not enormous development though. It's typically 4 to around 8 stories. But it provides a number of the things that the previous speakers were talking about. Last week over in Adelaide with the other capital city Lord Mayors, I released a report that we've been working on now for some years called Smart Growth, which we did as capital city Lord Mayors in conjunction with Urbis. And it outlines the principles of smart growth, not well understood here in Australia, but very well understood in North America in cities like Vancouver and throughout Europe as well. And the things that it says about growing smart are not, as my dear daughter would say, rocket surgery. But it's very rare that you find them all happening together. So a variety of uses, commercial, residential and retail. Affordability and mixture of housing stock. Availability of transport modes. High quality public realm. Access to employment. And finally, and I would argue not least of these, a coherent and consistent vision to deliver all of those things in each of those communities. That's smart growth in a quick nutshell. And yet I would ask you, when we do those developments that some of the other speakers have talked about, have we ticked every one of those boxes? Because if we haven't, is that what we really want? Dumb growth? I wouldn't have thought so. I would have thought that's almost oxymoronic. We want smart growth. So I would say in conclusion to you, I'm very proud of our city. We're a kind of a success story that in some ways makes us a victim of our success. On a very quiet day in the City of Melbourne, 840,000 people pass through our CBD and use our city. And that makes us the vibrant and prosperous and diverse and exciting place that we are. On a really busy day, it's 1 million people passing through the centre of the city. 25% of our city's population using the centre of our city. So we are powerful users of where, on that earlier map, you saw that concentration of transport and jobs. And by the way, while I'm on jobs, and I now have to talk about the core city, because one of our dangers is we're growing as 2 cities, a high-speed and a slow-speed city. I know we've all been worried about job losses and losing Ford and losing Toyota and losing GMH. If you take out of Victoria every single automotive job in direct manufacturing or in downstream componentry, the ABS says that's 24,500 jobs. I can tell you in the core city, in the last 5 years, we have generated 77,500 new jobs. And I promise you, they're not just people making coffee. They're people in construction, new construction of buildings, and more importantly, the 560 buildings throughout the city that are being retrofitted for energy efficiency as we sit here today. They're jobs in biotech and clean tech and education and professional services. They are all the jobs of that knowledge economy that we would want to generate. Problem for wider metropolitan Melbourne is they're being generated here in the core city. So it's a different story from the rest of our city. The final point I want to make is around that and around employment and how we proceed and how we build. You might not know the City of Melbourne has a flag, but it does. And in the 4 quadrants of that flag, there's a fleece, an ox and a whale, the primary products that were the source of our wealth, and a sailing ship, the method by which we got them to market and by which we traded. It's emblematic of the source of our prosperity and what made us the first city we were. The next wave of prosperity you can see as you wander around in those beautiful Victorian buildings built with gold, built on that prosperity. The third wave of prosperity was through manufacturing, particularly built on cheap but dirty brown coal out of the Latrobe Valley. Cheap power meant manufacturing, meant prosperity. But if I look at where our city is going, and I know we've talked a lot about the built form and the connectedness of built form tonight, but if you're talking about people, then really the employment central question is, where are they to be employed in our next wave of prosperity, in our next wave of inclusiveness for people being employed? And the answer is in exactly where those 77,500 jobs are created. It's in the knowledge economy. It's in advanced manufacturing and clean technology and biotechnology and education and design and all of those things that we do very, very well, including the professional services that support them. And yes, it is in hospitality and events and retail and those things as well. So I feel that when you look at the very best of what we do grow smart, both in the built environment and in the social environment and in the employment environment as well. The part that disappoints me and the part that worries me about the future of our city is not that we can't do that smart growth as we do grow. It's that we choose, either through ignoring it or laziness or just not wanting to really take the trouble, we choose dumb growth over smart growth. That would finish up with dumb Melbourne, not smart Melbourne, and I'm for a smart Melbourne.
Okay, over to you. Can I please invite our four eminent speakers to the front?
What are some of the ways that that we can be engaged and involved in developing your vision? Do you think that current consultation, if it's appropriate to the evolving process that we're going through and that we will continue to go through?
Micaela, would you like to start?
I might start off. There are lots of opportunities to be a part of the conversation. If you go onto any council websites, you'll usually see there's some sort of consultation going on. But I think what we're after is meaningful conversations, meaningful consultations where people feel like they're being heard as well. I mentioned the Planning and Environment Act, and right now the only emphasis on engagement is really the right to object. And it's not about creating those visions and about coming up with solutions. So I think we need to retweak the planning system so it encourages ideas rather than challenging what is being put forward as well. So that's one different way, and also looking at the different mediums, and people are embracing that now as well. It's not just coming to a town hall environment, it's using online facilities, it's using social media, there's post-it notes out the back, there's lots of different opportunities, but I do think it should be driven from people as well. Don't wait to be asked. Come up with the answer yourself and make sure that people listen as well.
Rob?
Yeah, look, I'd like to add that I think it's a very flawed system at the moment, particularly for those in our community that don't have a voice, but also for people who genuinely want to be involved but rarely get a comprehensive view of where their community is at and where it's going to and what that might mean for a place. So, I've gone to too many meetings where it's inappropriate to have aged housing, whether it's on a main road, in a quiet street, opposite a bowling club, above shops. It's never the right spot for aged housing. But the statistics show the vast majority of occupiers of that housing will come from that postcode. So we have this mismatch that the 80-year-old or the 75-year-old doesn't go to the public meeting, typically. And same for the homeless. They don't have a voice. And the disadvantaged. And the students rarely have a voice. The researchers, they're too busy off trying to get the next grant to participate. So I think we need a much more... a process that actually invites discussion from people who will actually add to our understanding of it, and by all means still embrace those who participate at the moment, but try and create a more well-researched discussion.
Robert?
One thing that really depresses me is that as you go up through the tiers of government, and I've been into, and I've dealt with the third, the federal one, they get less nimble. In fact, they get glacial by the time you get to national governments. And so I think there's a real opportunity at local level to go beyond just the normal sort of consultative process, which I think local government does pretty well. When I came to the City of Melbourne, we experimented with a wiki which had over, I think, 17,000 meaningful contributions around how people saw the city being organised. You know, if you like, the portfolios of the city that they saw as being important. So we reconstructed the way that our bureaucracy is configured to reflect that. And that was a direct piece of work from a wider community. I think it's also incumbent upon us to take a few chances. And I know this is not a new idea, but one thing that we will trial is the participatory democracy that does select a group of 40 to 50 citizens and then hands to them the problem that council would deal with and asks them to go through those elements which they think are important to the community and then to recommend to us what the answers might be. So I think it's incumbent upon us not just to say that engagement and participation is important, but to actually find methodologies that are far more aggressive in reaching into what is an increasingly disengaged community with their levels of government.
I'm Mary Dross, the convener of Planning Backlash, a coalition of about 250 resident groups across Melbourne, and I think we've got a pretty good grasp of what people are wanting across Melbourne. We're talking about the outer areas, the middle suburbs and the city and Docklands. The general feeling right across is quite opposed to what our Lord Mayor thinks, that you're not able to have a smart Melbourne with the amount of growth we're getting. You can't keep up with the infrastructure. You're way behind with everything. And I want to tonight lay down a challenge to you, Mr. Lord Mayor, a challenge to debate Kelvin Thompson, the federal member for Coburg, who is opposed to the amount of growth we're getting. Are you prepared to publicly debate him on this subject?
Well, the answer is yes, because I think he's wrong. I'm not frightened of a big Melbourne.
So when can we have the debate?
Hang on. I'm not frightened of a big Melbourne. I don't think you can pull up the drawbridge and say, that's it, Melbourne full. I really worry about that.
I don't think anybody's saying that.
Well, yes, they are. If you're not going to grow, where are you going to fit them?
It's the rate of growth we've got, Mr. Lord Mayor, that's the problem, and you are not keeping up with the infrastructure.
Mary, I think you've...
Hang on.
So when can we have the debate and where?
Well,
Mary,
I'm sorry, you're the one organising it, as I understand.
Can I just...
But the point I would make is this. That is only true, and that was the point I was making where the research shows it, that where you continue to spread and you continue to expand the urban growth boundary, that's where you don't keep up. In fact, if you're going to get those extra people, and we are growing very rapidly, the fastest growing major city in Australia, then the place to put them is where the jobs and the infrastructure are, but with the upgrading of the infrastructure to deal with those people. I don't see an alternative to that.
Okay, thank you. Rob, do you want to jump in there?
I'd like to say that I think when you actually have a deep conversation with communities, it's a little more nuanced than what Mary's put. I went through a very long process with the citizens of Ivanhoe recently on a vision for future Ivanhoe. They had been lamenting some earlier work on it. But when they understood what their community profile was, how it had changed, and then it was put to them, for example, you're now 70 years old, your partner has just had a hip operation, you are told you can no longer live in the family home. What part of this city do you think could change to accommodate your need for lifted accommodation near shops, services and public transport? And the same question that your kids leaving home. You want to keep them close. They're heroic, they're out there, etc., but you're not quite sure yet. They don't want to have a car. They're going to walk from the station at night. Where do you want them to live? And over many workshops, over many weeks, we had lots of green dots on maps saying this is an appropriate place for multi-level development around our town centre, around our stations, that meets our future needs as a community. People were happy to engage in that discussion, and the structure plan bears testament to that. So I think it is a more nuanced discussion, but it needs strong advocacy by those putting the questions to
there are a lot of strong positions out there, and Micaela was putting one of them earlier, and that is options. And the demographics are compelling. Exactly. We've got a question up here.
I'd like to pick up on the Lord Mayor's point about the tiers of government and how you move up into the stratosphere and become divorced from the real needs of the community. I wonder if the vacant seat in the middle is for Mr Guy, the planning... No,
it's actually for me, but I thought I could probably control traffic better.
Yeah, but it's symbolic. It could be for the planning minister who should be here, because we can discuss this till the cows come home, but local government can do nothing under the current regime, as we all well know with VCAT. And I've been through this personally a number of times in the inner circle of suburbs, and we've had years of battling the inappropriate development. But all the planning is brilliant, covering up productive land. South Australia has recently legislated to stop residential estates on valuable agricultural land and land that has vineyards on. If South Australians can do it, why can't Victoria do it? But there is no will evident in the current state government.
That sounds like one for Micaela, initially at least. Others may wish to jump in. Do you want to grab that?
I think you made an excellent point in that there is confusion and contradiction in terms of who has the planning authority. A lot of people are misled or misunderstand that it is local government, but local government are delegated that authority from state government, and state government does have the opportunity to take back that delegation whenever they wish. So I think we do need to clarify whose roles and whose responsibilities there is for our cities. But I do think it comes back to my earlier suggestion that rather than debating the process and coming up against each other, that we need to work cohesively together. And I think it is possible at the national, state and local levels as well, but we do need to be outcome focused as well. And I think there's lots of commonalities, and I think Robert Doyle came up, he made some excellent points that there's some fantastic examples of what's happening in metropolitan Melbourne that has come from all different levels of government, but we need to all be singing from the same hymn sheet.
Brendan, do you come across this sort of barrier to change, progress, and the level of, disempowered people that you're trying to help?
Yeah, I think one of the great things about Melbourne is that there is that cohesiveness, and I think there are those influential relationships, and I think you're the king of influential relationships, Lord Mayor. I've actually got an application in for some extra funding, so I've got to throw this in.
When have I ever said no to you, Brendan?
Well, I've got my list here. No, that's not true. But I think there is that there's that cohesiveness in Melbourne, which I think is a really good thing. And I think I understand there is debate, and I understand there are difficulties. But I think if we continue to work together, we can actually overcome some of those difficulties. I think the really good thing too is we do have some advocates on behalf of disadvantaged people, but we need more voices in that space too to speak up. And I think it's not necessarily about not enough people listening, it's perhaps not enough people speaking up on behalf of those that have no voice.
And I think that gets back to what I was talking about at the beginning too, that there is this power in the community, and people are bringing about an enormous amount of change. There are 600,000 community organisations in this country. There are 6.5 million volunteers. 5% of GDP comes from the not-for-profit sector. I could go on and on about social enterprise and impact investing, and those things have a lot of potential to help here. There's a question just here.
You all seem to be talking about sort of the community coming together to have their say and to participate in achieving a smart city. And I think everyone here is testament to that will to attempt to do that. But how do we stop the big players, whether it be the big commercial interests, the large land developers who want to develop or out in the outer fringe, and how do we also prevent the top end of government coming along and whacking us with a tunnel that is going to really devastate big areas of our inner city?
Lord Mayor, perhaps you could take that first, please, because given your experience in 2 tiers of government, how the hell did we break those boundaries by 50% when they were supposed to be inviolable?
Yeah, inviolable, a movable feast. Look, I'm going to answer that slightly differently. Your question seems to suggest to me that working with the private sector, is something we have to be very careful of. And I know that wasn't all of what you said. But I think one of the things that we can do is look at new models of partnership. If there's one thing that this city does better than anywhere else I know, it's partnerships. Whether it's between not-for-profits and government and the private sector, which we have here, we're very good at it. Let me give you an example of my vision of the future and how that might work. You might know, if you go out King Street, going out of the city and you go through the casino, if you look down on your left on City Road, there's a beautiful old heritage school. It's called Boyd School. We bought that for a fairly reasonable sum of money and then spent about another $8 million. So I got to about $20 million. But what we did was we took an old, beautiful heritage building, we turned it into a community hub for South Bank. A library, some creative spaces, some community meeting spaces, some aged and community facilities. Then we went to market. We went to the private sector and we said, okay, you can build some height here because it's right next to King Street. But what I want in that height is I want about, in 300 apartments, I want about 40 that are for affordable living, and you must partner with an organisation that can deliver that. And I want about 40 for people with a disability. And you can choose them, but that's the return I want for giving you some height on this site, and I want you to pay me for the site. And by the way, the final 1/3 of that site, you are going to landscape for the wider South Bank community where green open space is at such a premium. We had 4 viable tender applications for that project. And so in the end, what we will get is great open space where there was none, wonderful community facility, a social outcome in the housing for those with disabilities and those on low incomes, and there'll be a commercial development there as well. And the way we got that was being proactive with the private sector by saying, you can partner with us, but here are the rules. Yep. And when we didn't do that in parts of Docklands, we got results that we're even now trying to reverse engineer to turn into community. Yep. And it's a mistake we must not make over that wider area in the middle of the city.
Rob?
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more than with what the Lord Mayor is saying. I think there are just simply too many demands on the public purse, for the public purse to deliver everything the city needs straight away. And at the same time, the adage of, the market knows, leave it to the market, has been found to have patently failed at Docklands, for example. I mean, how many swimming pools can you put within, 5 square kilometres that you can't learn to swim in? But, you can imagine if there had been a vision for that place up front of saying, you will all contribute to a shared swimming complex, an MSAC of Docklands. And it might be in Joe Blogg's building or Lucy Lou's building, but and somebody else the library. We would have much more opportunities for opportunistic engagement of people around community from day one, with that idea of us rather than me. So I think we've got to learn. I mean, we're pretty new at this, rebuilding our city, but it's really incumbent on the city to learn from and be open about that learning, about, well, what can we learn from Docklands that we won't do again? We'll do it different at Arden, Macaulay or Eagate or wherever. It will be a much more inclusive approach, and that's how it's going to be, and it'll work much better.
Brendan, do you find if you approach, you are well received, and do you get approached on this sort of project?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, just pick up on your point, Rob, I think when Melbourne's been at its best, it's been when people have been willing to partner and work together and listen.
Exactly.
I think we've got it completely wrong, and I'll be blunt and say I think we've got it wrong with the tunnel when a vision from somebody else is imposed upon the community, and those opportunities for discussion and listening are ignored. And I think Melbourne needs to learn a lesson around what's happened with the tunnel. And we also need to look at the lessons that we've learned from Docklands, which arose because I think developers got involved and did not listen.
Micaela. Docklands really seems to strike a chord at a lot of levels, doesn't it? Micaela, would you like to add anything on that sort of collaborative level?
Yeah, the only thing I'd like to add is, whilst I agree with all the points, I think there's also something that we need to keep in mind, and is you don't know what you don't know. So for the developers of Docklands, they might have thought that they were developing some fantastic buildings and meeting the needs of the people that would be living there. But as time's gone on, we've realised, well, maybe we're not, and maybe there's some new things that we should introduce. When we have the outer suburbs growing at a rapid rate and taking up our agricultural land, and the focus is on housing and on roads, when we learn, and as time goes by, that maybe we need to focus a bit more on public transport, maybe we need to introduce the schools and the health services a bit sooner, we do start to see changes, and there are some pilots happening in the outer suburbs as well as inner and the middle suburbs as well, where we are trialling new things. We are putting health at the centre of planning. There's Salandra Rise out in the city of Casey there, where we are trialling that, and we are capturing what's happening, and the researchers are busily researching and seeing, have we got it right? So I think unless people do highlight what's working and what's not working, we will feel like we're not being heard.
So you'll very much build it and they will come, rather than go there and hope they bloody well build it when we get there.
I'm a bit of both.
There's a lady up here, and then we have a question down the front.
Hello, my name's Ros. I'd like to ask the question about how the resources that are involved in land, when it gets rezoned for development, and we do need to have this development within the parameters rather than spreading, as you well outlined, how can we have more access to the community, to the resources that are made for available, to be available for the community, so there can be cooperative partnerships and more power for the community with access to resource for the infrastructure to have a smart development as you've proposed in areas like Fisherman's Bend and the other areas that you're suggesting are being done, as well as areas on the fringe, so that rezoning that takes place becomes a community value, not just value for the developers. Thank you.
Everybody is nodding, so let's start with Rob.
Yeah, look, it's all about timing. I think we really made a mistake at Fisherman's Bend with rezoning and handing all the development uplift to the incumbent owners before we had put in place the vision for the systems, community infrastructure, etc., that we would need for that place. It's just the wrong way around. And so there was no value capture and sharing. By all means, they get some of the uplift, but they should also bear some of the cost, as should all of those who move into there over future years and benefit from the infrastructure that's put in. But in that case, we let the horse bolt way too early.
Brendan?
I'm fine with this one.
Lord Mayor?
I don't quite agree with Rob that we didn't put that plan in place. I would argue that we do have a community hard and soft infrastructure plan for Fisherman's Bend far in advance of what we did with Docklands, because we did it with the City of Port Phillip and with others as well. It might not be a complete blueprint, but it's certainly a very good guide about what infrastructure should be and where it should be and where the transport should be. And I've been down arguing about a part of that today. But to answer the question more generally, I've got interested recently in value capture, because we don't do it very well as practices change. So a 5% developer contribution on the value of the land as it's subdivided and developed probably no longer reflects the cost of providing the wider community infrastructure that should go with the value that is being generated by that, either rezoning or development or whatever. So we've proposed that, on new developments it be 8% because the cost of providing that wider community infrastructure is no longer covered by the 5%. And I'm also interested in looking at, particularly on, and I know this is very sort of city-centric, which is where I am, but, where you do large developments on very small allotments, what is the value capture on the individual apartments that's going to be needed in order to develop the infrastructure that those very people will use, but won't be provided by any sort of developer contribution? So I think partly it's about the models of value capture, and I think that we've outgrown the models that we have presently.
Micaela, do you want to jump in there quickly?
Only to add, in terms of the developer contributions and the models that we use there, is that we also need to ask ourselves, what is the community infrastructure that we want? What is the community infrastructure that any new development may need or may want? I think we've moved on from traditional models. I don't know if people want a communal common space to go to. Maybe it looks a little different. Maybe it's more investment in Wi-Fi or something like that.
Okay, there's a gentleman at the front here.
Hello, I'm Robert Bierman. I like to think globally and act locally. My resources are very small. I'm not able to think on the scope that these people here do. Some years ago, I decided I would buy a rooming house. I thought when I walked into the place, I was astonished how bad it was. And I went to my local police station, I went to the building inspector, the health inspector, and the local Salvation Army. The only people who encouraged me, in fact, were the Salvation Army. The others just ridiculed the whole idea that I might make something of this thing and make it pleasant for people. The first step I did was ask the people living there what did they want. First thing was, of course, free beer, which I ignored. The next one was, bullshit, you're not going to do anything, you're just not in it for the money. And the third person said to me, what can you do to stop my doors being kicked in? Right? Then I knew I had a project. Because as long as I could get people who are interested in their own future to take the matter seriously, I knew there was something I could do. I then went back to the police, the health inspector, the building inspector and said, I have an idea, let's go forward. And I got the same laughter as I did before. In the community, I got nothing but the NIMBY response. And there's two things I want to draw out of this. Firstly, there are things that people can do on a very small scale in this space. And the other thing is that the most crushing part of this whole exercise, and I did succeed very quickly, I might add, the most crushing difficulty was the negative attitudes of those institutions.
Yep.
Do you have any comment?
Thank you. Do you know Matt Maudlin out at Servants Community Housing in Hawthorn? Look him up. He's doing what you're doing, and he's doing it very well.
Look, I really empathise with you. I have been in public meetings representing community housing groups, and I see former Councillor Port Phillip, Janet Bolitho up here, and I think it does need strong advocacy from local government, taking Robert's point and Micaela's, about how important it is to keep communities together. And you need to be prepared to, as a designer or advocate for that, to take the flak. You know, I had people saying it was important that they had sun on their cars when they went to the local shopping centre. And, you know, these people who were going to move in here were going to eat their children, they were going to vandalise their fences, they were going to, you know, whatever was the worst possible thing you could imagine, it appeared in leaflets and etc. Surprise, surprise, you know, the person, you know, one of the original objectors in one case gets their cat looked after when they go on holidays by one of the residents. Why? Because they're local people, they've lived there all their life, they know the culture of this place, they are part of this place. And it's, you know, it's incumbent on all of us, I think, to be a little compassionate and also say, there but for the grace of God go I, and really go in to bat for people that don't have that voice. So all power to you, but we need, I mean, a lot of it's fear, and I've found that when you took people through the facts and you invited them to go and have a look at another Port Phillip housing project, and they saw people, they talked to people, they talked to neighbours, and Port Phillip facilitated that, the reasonable people dissipated. The reasonable people didn't want a bar of any objection after that.
Brendan, you must sort of, I'm sorry to interrupt, Rob, we're out of time, so I'm going to have to wrap things up, but you must live this all the time, and I wonder what experience you're having and are expecting to have with the Collingwood project.
Yep. I feel like hugging you, Rob. That's fantastic. Congratulations on what you've done. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Fantastic. On a couple of levels, you listened. You asked the question and you listened and you acted. So good on you. That's superb. And we've got people that refuse to go into rooming houses and prefer to live on the streets because they say it's safer than the streets than it is to live in some rooming houses. So the fact that you've asked the question, you've listened and acted upon that is excellent. I think the other thing too is there was an investigation recently into the Department of Consumer Affairs, and it was found that investigators were going to rooming houses to see if they were regulated or not, and they found that the investigations took under a minute at each rooming house. So those investigators from the Department of Consumer Affairs actually weren't going into the rooming houses because they were scared. And when they actually started to ask the questions and engage people inside the rooming houses, they found they weren't animals, they were actually human beings. And they had a lot of really good input to provide to the investigators of Consumer Affairs. And some changes come about because finally people started to ask the question, listen and act.
Robert Doyle, sorry, go on, Brendan. So, thank you. Are you finding attitudes changing, particularly after Mouse's death down on North Bank?
You'd hope so. You would really hope so. And I echo Brendan, good on you. Good on you for what you've done. You know, there are some things that just uplift me so much. Working with Brendan is one of those things. Working with Rob on Drill Hall, you know, probably the thing I'm most proud of. Many of you will know Brian Lipman, who's just a genius in the Wintringham model, who takes people who've been on the streets for decades and puts them into housing, sometimes for the very first time in their lives, and makes it work. And I reckon you were on the right thing there, regardless of authorities. And I often feel people look at me and they say, "Yeah, Rob, it's people like you." And I think, no, don't tar me quite yet. In our local area, we have, and it's paradoxical. There are people in, and I will mention it because it drives me mad. You know, there are people in Toorak saving up to move to St Vincent's Place in Albert Park, and there is a rooming house there. And the residents of that rooming house are very well known in our local community and highly regarded. We know Jimmy, we know Neville. And so it's not the people in the community where they move that are the problem. It is the proprietors of that rooming house and the way that those people are treated there and the way they're pushed out on the street at 6 a.m. in the morning that distresses me. So while there are some wonderful examples, and good on you too, you're quite right, there are some examples where we need to do a whole lot more work. But I'm a great optimist about the community. And I agree. In the end, people of good heart will actually jump in behind you and say, hey, hang on, as exactly Brendan did. The point that Brendan made about Wayne Perry, about Mouse, and the point I tried to make was this wasn't a homeless person that was killed here, it was a person.
Micaela, would you like to have the final word?
Just to congratulate you again for your work in rooming houses and what everyone else has said. It meets a need in our community, and sometimes there's a fear associated with it. But if you're providing people with a safe option for somewhere to live, I think that's a good thing.
I think that's a great place to leave it, and that leaves us with the idea of compassion and collaboration and community. Can you please thank our speakers again, Rob McGauran, Brendan Nottle, Robert Doyle and Micaela Drieberg. I don't know about you, but I think there are just some wonderful ideas in there, and there's obviously a hell of a lot for us to do, and I think the reason everybody's here tonight is because you care. Finally, thank you very much for being here. Remember, there is no them, there's just us, and that means you. Thank you, good night, and go well.